Welcome to Durham Cathedral's online Quiet Day. My name is Clark Berge, and I'm the guardian of Hilfield Friary in Dorset in the south of England. We're Anglican Franciscans, and there have been Franciscans in the Church of England since 1921. And our order, the Society of St. Francis, was founded in 1937. So I've been a brother for 28 years. So the theme of this quiet day is St. Francis, creation and climate crisis. And so I want to share with you about Francis's care for creation and how we can learn from his example to encourage us as we seek to address the climate crisis we live in today. I think the most well-known teaching of Franciscan spirituality is about Francis's love of poverty and care for the poor, lepers, beggars, the marginalized, people suffering. In the 21st century, the earth, in Franciscan terms, is the poor. She is hurting and suffering and moved with compassion, pity, and fierce determination. We must care for her against all the powers that plunder her for gain. The main thing about Francis and his care for creation is that it grew out of his love for God. His love for God and the recognition that all things have a common origin in God, and thus we are kin to every created thing. He popularized his notion by referring to everything with the term brother or sister. And the summation of his spirituality can be found in the beautiful poem that he wrote, the Canticle of the Creatures. Praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially, Sir Brother Sun. And there are lots of popular versions of this song. Perhaps you remember from Brother Sun, Sister Moon, the film by Zeffirelli, the song that Dominic sang. So this sense of connection wasn't just pious feeling, but because he experienced beauty and the power of God in all creation, he approached it with a special reverence. One of the most extreme and yet typical acts of reverence that Francis did was his care for worms. Taking the words of the psalmist as the words of Christ in Psalm 22, "I'm a worm and no man," Francis took special care not to trod on any worms, and it said that if he found one on the road, he would pick it up and take it to the side. Well, there are many stories in the Franciscan canon of other encounters with nature. Some are apocryphal, some with more verifiable basis in fact. There is a popular story of the time Francis encountered a wolf near the town of Gubbio. And this wolf was terrorizing the town and harassing their sheep, and the villagers wanted to kill it. But Francis convinced him not to, and he insisted on befriending it. Approaching it, he is said to have called boldly, "Peace, Brother Wolf." He preached to birds, and his companions were amazed at their apparent attentiveness. And then they flew away, singing. So this encounter became a sign to the early Franciscans that the gospel was to be shared with all and preached throughout the world like singing birds flying away. The insight that we are all together part of the same creation, all come from the same loving design, is an obvious starting place for praying our way into the care for creation in these days of crisis. But Francis has more to teach us than befriending wolves and preaching to birds. Because not only did he see the divine connection and pattern, he had real strengths of character that might inform the way that we approach the powers and principalities of the world as we tackle climate change. For Francis, everything pointed to God, and thus was an occasion to speak about God's transformative love that empowers us to live differently in the world. So his starting place was always love, God's initiative. And so Francis was always calling people to account, holding up the example of Christ and the teachings of the gospel. And so as people who care about the climate crisis, we need to nurture some Franciscan fearlessness, I think. So Francis found ways to engage with wolves, but even more powerfully, he sat down and spoke with the enemy of his people, the Sultan, Kamal al-Malik. Francis was willing to be martyred, but instead the encounter blazed the path for interreligious dialogue. And so it poses the question, who are the enemies that we need to speak with, and how can we find ways to speak with them when creates a climate of listening and transformation that moves beyond defensiveness and competition and the desire to hurt? How can we foster a sense of kinship with those that we believe are killing us? Another quality that Francis offers us is the example of his utter reliance on God. From choosing which direction to go on the road, it's said that he would twirl around and around until he fell down, and then the direction that he fell in would be the direction that he would take. He believed that that was the way God pointed the way forward for him. We may not need to do that, but from that to living a marginal lifestyle of begging, actually Francis turned his life over to God's care. So how do we do that? This wasn't a passive kind of defeatist relinquishing, but I believe it was a revolutionary drilling down into the deep reservoirs of that resurrection power that makes all things new. Francis asked people for help, for food, for shelter, for everything, all for the love of God. And he believed and he taught that their help made them his accomplices in a different way of living as human beings. So they were allies. By asking for help, working together, who are our allies? This is an essential piece to our work and change in addressing climate change. Finding our allies, linking up together. Most radically, this new way of living for Francis involved the rejection of violence in all its forms. Not only was he opposed to weapons and war, he opposed Franciscans riding horses because they were integral to the war of his day. He rejected the use and handling of money because money caused strife. He insisted that his brothers reject ownership because if you own things, you ended up fighting to defend them. So what are some of the comparable things in our own lives? How can we take this Franciscan example and give it some kind of teeth in the 21st century? So riding horses is not necessarily connected to war. We don't need to worry about that. But what about the kind of vehicles we drive? Some of the big souped up automobiles, in America we call them Hummers, which are actually machines used in war. Maybe we could reject that. Maybe we could reject internal combustion engines. Maybe we could move more towards electric vehicles or using the public transportation or walking and riding our bicycles. All these would be part of a sort of a Franciscan movement of protest, consciousness raising, and living differently, which would bring healing and hope to the world. Because no action is too small. Minority is one of the things that Francis prized above all, that we are little brothers, so small actions, small things can make a big difference. Francis's example is one of walking the talk, maintaining congruence between what he preached and how he lived. And when he was wrong, he promptly admitted it and broadened his approach to bring the message home. So it is out of a deep sense of being part of a wide web of creation, Francis stitched together a way of living that sought harmony with plants and animals. He pioneered creative ways of addressing grievances with human enemies, recognizing that all humanity bears the common likeness of God. He innovated creative ways to make the message of peace and justice for creation to catch hold in the imaginations of men and women, thus agitating our souls with grace and love for over 800 years. So we need to open ourselves in prayer to be agitated by God's love, by God's grace, which will enable us to live differently, live boldly, live fearlessly into this new way of being human, which is what is at stake in this climate crisis. So what are some of the biblical teachings that inform your life? We've heard some of the ones that informed Francis and have become critical points of reflection for Franciscans. Where do you need to take courage to embrace people and situations that frighten you? Francis embraced the lepers. Who are the people or situations that make you want to run away? Can your reliance on God free you to act boldly, to bring peace and healing to our beautiful and fragile world? So thank you for joining us for this quiet day. Midday prayer will be live streamed at 12 noon, and our second address will take place at 2:30 p.m.